My name is Rachel, and last Tuesday I watched my stepfather's face turn white as paper when I handed him the will my mother had signed just 7 days before her death. 7 days before he thought he'd inherit everything she'd worked for her entire life. But to understand the magnitude of that moment, I need to take you back 15 years, to when my mother first met the man who would spend the next decade and a half slowly stealing her life away, piece by piece. My mom, Catherine Morrison, was 52 when she met David Brennan at a grief support group in 2008. She'd been widowed for 3 years after my dad died of a sudden heart attack, and she was finally ready to consider the possibility of finding love again. I was 26 at the time, living in Chicago and building my career as a physical therapist. Mom lived in our hometown of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, in the same house where she'd raised me and my younger brother Jake. It was a modest but comfortable 3-bedroom ranch that my parents had paid off just 2 years before Dad died. Mom had always been incredibly independent and financially responsible. She worked as a registered nurse at the local hospital, had a solid retirement account, owned her home outright, and had a life insurance payout from Dad's death that she'd invested carefully. She wasn't wealthy, but she was secure, which was more than a lot of people could say. When she started talking about David during our weekly phone calls, I was genuinely happy for her. She deserved companionship, deserved to have someone to share meals with and travel with and grow old alongside. "He's so kind, Rachel," she told me during one of our conversations. "He really listens when I talk about your father, doesn't get jealous or try to compete with those memories. He understands what it means to lose someone you love." David had lost his wife to cancer 2 years before meeting my mom. He had 2 adult children who lived on the East Coast, and like Mom, he was navigating the challenge of building a new life after profound loss. "He makes me laugh," Mom said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. I'd forgotten what that felt like. I met David for the first time at Christmas that year. He was a tall, distinguished-looking man with salt and pepper hair and an easy smile. He was attentive to my mom, helped with dinner preparations without being asked, and seemed genuinely interested in hearing about my work and Jake's college experiences. "Your mother talks about you constantly," he told me while we were cleaning up after dinner. "She's so proud of the woman you've become." "She raised me well," I said, watching Mom through the kitchen window as she and Jake built a snowman in the backyard like they had when we were kids. "She's an incredible woman," David agreed. "I feel very lucky that she's willing to share her life with me." Over the next year, David became a regular fixture in Mom's life. He'd drive her to church on Sundays, accompany her to family gatherings, and help with household projects that had been neglected since Dad died. He seemed to genuinely care about her happiness and well-being. When they got engaged in the fall of 2009, I was supportive despite some nagging concerns I couldn't quite articulate. Maybe it was just protective instincts, or maybe it was the way David sometimes spoke about money and inheritance during family conversations. "Catherine's been so wise with her investments," he'd say during dinner, usually after a few glasses of wine. "She's built something really substantial here." "Dad always said Mom was better with money than he was," Jake would respond, not picking up on the calculating undertone in David's voice that made me uncomfortable. The wedding was small and lovely, held in Mom's backyard with close family and friends. Mom wore a pale blue dress that made her look younger than her 54 years, and David seemed genuinely emotional during their vows. "Catherine, you've given me hope for a future I thought I'd lost," he said, his voice thick with what appeared to be genuine emotion. "I promise to love and protect you for whatever time we have left together." At the time, those words seemed romantic. Looking back, I wonder if they were a threat. The first year of their marriage seemed happy. David moved into Mom's house, and they settled into comfortable routines of shared meals, weekend trips, and quiet evenings watching television together. Mom seemed content, more relaxed than she'd been since Dad died. But gradually, things began to change in ways that were subtle at first, then increasingly concerning. It started with David's suggestions about Mom's finances. He thought she was being too conservative with her investments, that she should be taking advantage of opportunities to grow her nest egg more aggressively. "Catherine, you're sitting on money that could be working harder for you," he'd say during family dinners. "I have a friend who's made incredible returns in real estate investing." "I'm comfortable with my current portfolio," Mom would respond. "I'd rather have security than risk losing what I've built." "But think about what you could leave for Rachel and Jake," David would press. "Wouldn't you want to maximize their inheritance?" The conversation always came back to inheritance, to the idea that Mom owed it to her children to take financial risks that would benefit us after her death. It was manipulative in a way that made me deeply uncomfortable, but Mom seemed to find his concern for our future touching. Over the next few months, David's financial advice became more insistent. He started bringing home brochures for investment opportunities, introducing Mom to friends who were involved in various business ventures, suggesting that her conservative approach to money was actually selfish. "Your mother is starting to trust my judgment more," he told me during a phone conversation when Mom was out running errands. "She's realizing that playing it safe isn't always the best strategy." "Mom's financial strategy has worked well for her so far," I said carefully. "She's been able to maintain her independence and security." "Independence is overrated when you're married," David replied, and something in his tone made my stomach clench with worry. That conversation happened in the spring of 2011, about 18 months after their wedding. It was the first time I'd heard David suggest that Mom's independence was a problem rather than an asset. By the following year, the changes in Mom's financial situation were becoming impossible to ignore. During my visit home for Thanksgiving 2012, I noticed that several valuable items were missing from the house. The antique china cabinet that had belonged to my grandmother was gone. The original artwork that my parents had collected over the years had been replaced with cheaper prints. When I asked Mom about it, she seemed flustered and evasive. "David thought we should simplify," she said, not meeting my eyes. "We decided to sell some things we weren't really using." "But Mom, that china cabinet was worth thousands of dollars. And those paintings were investments that Dad specifically chose because they would appreciate in value." "We needed the money for a business opportunity," she said, still not looking directly at me. "David's friend has a restaurant that's expanding, and we decided to invest." "We?" I asked. "Since when do you invest in restaurants?" "Since I married someone who understands business better than I do," Mom snapped, showing a defensiveness that was completely unlike her usual calm demeanor. That night, I lay in my childhood bedroom listening to David and Mom argue in hushed voices downstairs. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear. David was pressuring her about something, and Mom was resisting. The next morning, Mom seemed tired and defeated in a way that scared me. "Honey," I said as we prepared breakfast together, "is everything okay? You seem stressed about something." "Marriage is about compromise," she said, cracking eggs into a bowl with more force than necessary. "Sometimes you have to trust your partner's judgment, even when it doesn't feel comfortable." "But Mom, this is your money we're talking about. Money Dad worked his whole life to provide for you." She stopped whisking the eggs and looked at me with eyes that seemed older than they had just 2 years earlier. "Rachel, I know you mean well, but my marriage is between David and me. I need you to respect that." It was the first time my mother had ever shut down a conversation about something important, and it terrified me. Over the next few years, the pattern continued and intensified. Every time I visited home, more of Mom's possessions had disappeared, sold to fund David's latest investment opportunity. The house that had once been filled with the accumulated treasures of my parents' 30-year marriage was slowly being stripped bare. But it wasn't just the material possessions that were disappearing. Mom herself seemed to be fading away, becoming smaller and more uncertain with each passing month. She stopped talking about her own interests and hobbies, instead focusing all her conversation on David's projects and plans. She gave up her book club and her volunteer work at the hospital, saying that David needed her support with his business ventures. Most concerning of all, she transferred the deed of the house into joint ownership with David, something she told me about casually during a phone conversation, as if it were a minor detail. "You did what?" I asked, my heart racing with alarm. "David said it would be better for tax purposes," Mom explained. "Something about protecting the property if one of us needs long-term care." "Mom, that house is your security. It's the only major asset you have left." "It's our house now, Rachel. That's what marriage means." I tried to convince her to speak with a financial advisor, to at least get a second opinion about the decisions she was making. But David had isolated her from most of her longtime friends, and she'd become completely dependent on his guidance for all major decisions. Jake, who was now working as a teacher in Des Moines, was equally concerned but felt helpless to intervene. "She won't listen to us," he said during one of our worried phone conversations. "Every time we try to bring up our concerns about David, she gets defensive and shuts down the conversation." "I think he's financially abusing her," I said, using the term I'd learned during my research into elder abuse. "He's isolated her from her support system and convinced her that she can't trust her own judgment about money." "But what can we do? She's not legally incompetent. She's making these decisions voluntarily, even if we think they're wrong." That was the heartbreaking reality of watching someone you love be manipulated and controlled. Unless Mom was willing to admit that David was taking advantage of her, there was very little Jake and I could do to protect her. The situation reached a crisis point in 2017, 9 years into their marriage. Mom called me on a Tuesday evening, crying so hard I could barely understand what she was saying. "Rachel, I don't know what to do," she sobbed into the phone. "David says we need to refinance the house to cover some business debts. He says if we don't, we might lose everything." "Mom, slow down. Tell me exactly what's happening." Through her tears, she explained that David's latest investment, a franchise opportunity that was supposed to guarantee returns, had failed spectacularly. Not only had they lost the initial investment of $40,000, but David had signed personal guarantees that made them liable for additional debts. "How much are we talking about, Mom?" $150,000, she whispered. "David says the only way to cover it is to take out a second mortgage on the house." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. $150,000 represented most of Mom's remaining financial security. If they mortgaged the house to cover David's debts, she'd be left with virtually nothing. "Mom, you cannot sign those papers," I said firmly. "Please promise me you'll wait until I can drive up there and we can figure this out together." "David says we have to act quickly or the creditors will start seizing assets," she said, still crying. "He says this is the only way to protect what we have left." "Mom, listen to me. David got you into this mess with his bad decisions. You are not responsible for his debts, and you should not have to sacrifice your security to fix his mistakes." But by the time I drove to Cedar Rapids the following weekend, the papers had already been signed. David had convinced Mom that waiting would only make the situation worse, that acting quickly was the only way to protect their future. "It's done, Rachel," Mom said when I arrived, her voice flat and defeated. David handled everything. I looked around the house that had once represented stability and security for our family, and realized that David now owned half of it outright and held a mortgage on the rest. If anything happened to Mom, he would inherit everything, while she would have nothing left to pass on to her children. That night, I confronted David directly for the first time. "You financially destroyed my mother," I told him while Mom was in the shower. "You've taken a woman who was financially secure and turned her into someone who has to mortgage her home to cover your debts." David looked at me with a coldness I'd never seen before, dropping the facade of the caring husband he'd maintained for nearly a decade. "Your mother is an adult who makes her own decisions," he said calmly. "If you don't like those decisions, that's between you and her." "Those aren't her decisions, David. Those are your decisions that you've manipulated her into accepting." "Prove it," he said with a smile that made my skin crawl. And that was the problem. I couldn't prove it. Everything David had done was technically legal. Mom had signed every document willingly, even if that willingness had been obtained through manipulation and emotional coercion. Over the next 5 years, I watched helplessly as David continued to chip away at what remained of Mom's financial security. The second mortgage payments strained their budget, forcing Mom to dip into her retirement savings to cover basic living expenses. When I'd visit, I'd find Mom clipping coupons obsessively, buying generic groceries, wearing clothes that were years old and beginning to show wear. Meanwhile, David always seemed to have money for golf outings, new clothes, and dinners out with his friends. "David worked so hard managing our finances," Mom would say when I'd express concern about their obviously strained budget. "I don't want to burden him with questions about every little expense." "Mom, you have a right to know how your own money is being spent." "It's our money now, Rachel. I need to trust my husband's judgment." The phrase, "our money," always made me want to scream, because I knew the truth. It was Mom's money that David was spending, Mom's assets that were being depleted, Mom's financial security that was being sacrificed for David's lifestyle and poor decisions. But Mom had been so thoroughly convinced that she couldn't trust her own judgment about money that she'd given David complete control over every aspect of their financial life. The end came more suddenly than any of us expected. In March of this year, Mom started complaining about fatigue and shortness of breath. At first, she attributed it to getting older and being less active than she used to be. But when the symptoms persisted and worsened, I convinced her to see a doctor. The diagnosis was devastating: advanced heart failure, likely caused by years of untreated high blood pressure and the chronic stress that had become her constant companion. "The damage is quite extensive," the cardiologist explained during an appointment I attended via video call. "We can manage the symptoms and slow the progression, but we're looking at months, not years." Mom took the news with a calmness that broke my heart. "I've had a good life," she said quietly. "I raised 2 wonderful children, had a loving marriage with your father, and found love again when I thought that chapter was closed." I noticed she didn't mention David in her list of life's blessings. Over the next few months, Mom's condition deteriorated rapidly. The woman who had once been strong and independent became increasingly frail and dependent on others for basic care. David, to his credit, seemed attentive during Mom's illness. He drove her to medical appointments, helped her manage her medications, and made sure she was comfortable at home. For a brief time, I allowed myself to hope that maybe I'd been wrong about his motivations, that maybe he really did love Mom despite his financial manipulation. That illusion was shattered during what would be our last real conversation. I was visiting for what we all knew might be the last time. Mom was confined to bed, breathing with the help of an oxygen concentrator, but still mentally sharp and aware of what was happening. "Rachel, honey," she said, taking my hand with fingers that felt fragile as bird bones, "I need to tell you something important." "What is it, Mom?" "I know what David's been doing," she said quietly, glancing toward the door to make sure he wasn't within earshot. "I've known for years." I stared at her, not understanding. What do you mean? The investments, the business ventures, the way he's taking control of all our money. I know he's been using me, manipulating me, taking advantage of my grief and loneliness. Mom, if you knew, why didn't you stop him? Why didn't you protect yourself? She was quiet for a long moment, staring at the ceiling with eyes that held more sadness than I'd ever seen. Because I was scared of being alone again, she said finally. After your father died, the loneliness was so overwhelming I thought it might kill me. When David came along, even with all his flaws, he filled that emptiness. But Mom, you're not alone. You have Jake and me. You have friends who care about you. It's not the same, honey. You have your own lives to live. I couldn't bear the thought of going back to that empty house, eating dinner by myself every night, having no one to talk to about my day. She squeezed my hand with what little strength she had left. I made a choice to let David take my money in exchange for not being alone. It wasn't a good choice, but it was my choice. I was crying now, understanding for the first time the depths of my mother's desperation and the impossible position she'd felt trapped in. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry you felt like you had to choose between financial security and companionship. I'm sorry I couldn't find a way to help you. Oh, sweetheart, she said, reaching up to wipe my tears with her trembling hand. You tried to help, but some lessons we have to learn for ourselves. She paused, breathing carefully with the oxygen mask. But Rachel, I want you to know that I'm not leaving this world as helpless as David thinks I am. What do you mean? I mean that your mother may have been lonely and desperate, but she wasn't stupid. I've been keeping track of everything, documenting every transaction, every manipulation, every lie he told me to get access to my money. She gestured toward her dresser with a weak hand. Top drawer, behind the photo of you and Jake at Christmas. There's an envelope with copies of everything. Bank statements, loan documents, investment records, even recordings of some of our conversations about money. I stared at her, not understanding where this was leading. Mom, what are you planning to do with all that? I already did it, honey. Last week, while David was at his golf tournament, I had Mrs. Patterson drive me to see a lawyer. A real lawyer this time, not one of David's friends. My heart started racing as I began to understand what she was telling me. I changed my will, Rachel. David thinks he's going to inherit everything when I die, but he's not getting a penny. Mom, can you do that? Legally, I mean? Iowa isn't a community property state, she said with a smile that reminded me of the strong woman she'd been before David broke her down. The house is in both our names, so he'll get his half of that. But everything else, my retirement accounts, my life insurance, the money from your father's policy that I managed to keep separate, all of it goes to you and Jake. I was stunned. Even in her weakened state, even after years of manipulation and financial abuse, Mom had found a way to protect what remained of her legacy. There's more, she continued. I also created a detailed affidavit explaining how David manipulated me into making poor financial decisions, how he isolated me from friends and family, how he used my grief and loneliness to gain control over my money. What will that accomplish? It won't get the money back, she admitted. But it will make sure everyone knows the truth about what kind of man David really is. And it might help other women recognize the signs of financial abuse before it's too late. We spent the rest of that visit going through the documents Mom had hidden, and I was amazed by the thorough record she kept of David's manipulation tactics. She documented phone calls where he'd pressured her to invest in his schemes, saved emails where he'd made false promises about returns, and even recorded conversations where he'd berated her for questioning his judgment. I may have been lonely enough to let him take advantage of me, she said, but I was smart enough to document everything. Mom died peacefully in her sleep 3 days later, with Jake and me holding her hands. David was in the room too, and he seemed genuinely grief-stricken, though I couldn't tell if he was mourning the loss of his wife or the loss of his meal ticket. The funeral was held at the same church where Mom and Dad had been married 35 years earlier. It was a beautiful service, filled with stories about Mom's kindness, her dedication to her patients at the hospital, and her love for her family. David played the role of the grieving widower perfectly, accepting condolences with apparent grace and speaking movingly about the love he and Mom had shared. After the service, as we were gathering in the church basement for the reception, I overheard a conversation that made my blood run cold. David was talking quietly with his golf buddy, probably thinking they were out of earshot from the family. "I'm sorry for your loss, David, but I have to say, this might be a blessing in disguise," the friend was saying. Catherine's medical bills were really mounting up. "You're not wrong," David replied, his voice completely different from the grief-stricken tone he'd been using with other mourners. "The last few months have been financially brutal. Thank God that's over with." "So what's next for you? Are you thinking about selling the house?" "I'm thinking about a lot of things," David said with what sounded disturbingly like excitement. Catherine was always so conservative with money, so afraid of taking risks. Now I can finally make some real investment moves without having to convince her that every opportunity isn't a scam. I felt sick listening to him talk about my mother's death as a financial opportunity. But the worst was yet to come. "The truth is," David continued, lowering his voice even further, "I'm relieved. I loved Catherine, but she'd become such a burden these last few years. The medical appointments, the medications, the constant worry about money. Now I can be free." Free. He said he could finally be free now that my mother was dead. I stood there in the church basement, surrounded by people who were sharing fond memories of my mother, listening to her husband of 15 years talk about her death as his liberation. That's when I knew it was time. I walked over to where David was standing, still talking with his friend about his plans for the future. "David," I said, interrupting their conversation, "I'm sorry to bother you, but there's something we need to discuss privately." "Of course, Rachel," he said, immediately switching back to his bereaved widower voice. "Whatever you need." I led him to a quiet corner of the basement, away from the other mourners. "I wanted to give you this," I said, pulling an envelope from my purse. "It's something Mom asked me to make sure you received." David took the envelope with a confused expression. "What is it?" "Her will," I said simply. "The new one she signed last week." His face went pale as he opened the envelope and began reading the legal document inside. I watched him scan the pages, his expression changing from confusion to shock to horror as he realized what he was looking at. "This can't be right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Catherine wouldn't. She couldn't." "She could, and she did," I said calmly. "Mom knew exactly what you were doing to her, David. She knew about the manipulation, the financial abuse, the way you isolated her from her friends and family. She documented all of it." David was staring at the will like it was written in a foreign language. "She left you half the house, which is legally yours anyway since you manipulated her into putting your name on the deed. But everything else, her retirement accounts, her life insurance, the investments you didn't manage to lose, all of it goes to Jake and me." "This is impossible," David said, his hands shaking as he held the document. "Catherine would never. We were married. She loved me." "She felt sorry for you," I corrected. "There's a difference." I pulled out another envelope from my purse. "This is for you too. Mom's affidavit explaining how you spent 15 years financially abusing her. She wanted to make sure everyone understood exactly what kind of man you are." David opened the second envelope and began reading Mom's detailed account of his manipulation tactics. With each page, his face grew paler, and his hands shook more violently. She was confused, he said desperately. The medications, the illness, she wasn't thinking clearly. Actually, the lawyer confirmed that Mom was completely competent when she signed these documents. She answered all his questions correctly, demonstrated clear understanding of what she was doing, and explained her reasoning in detail. I watched David realize that his 15-year con had just collapsed around him. You can contest the will if you want, I continued. But Mom's documentation of your financial abuse is pretty comprehensive. I'm not sure you want all of that to become public record. David stood there in the church basement, surrounded by people who were mourning my mother's death, holding papers that proved he'd lost everything he thought he was going to inherit. You can't do this to me, he said, his voice taking on a desperate edge. I gave Catherine 15 years of my life. I took care of her when she was sick. I deserve something for that. You got exactly what you deserved, I said. You got 15 years of free room and board, access to Mom's money for your failed investments, and the companionship of a woman who was too kind for her own good. I looked around the room at all the people who had come to honor my mother's memory. But if you want to explain to everyone here how you told your golf buddy that your relieved mom is dead because now you can be free, I'm sure they'd be interested to hear about that. David's face went from pale to gray. He'd forgotten that grief makes people say things they don't mean to say, that church basements have excellent acoustics, and that I'd inherited my mother's sharp hearing along with her stubborn streak. I didn't mean it the way it sounded, he stammered. I know exactly how you meant it, I said. And so did Mom. That's why she made sure you wouldn't profit from her death. David looked around the room like a trapped animal, probably calculating whether he could convince anyone that I was lying about the will. The original documents are with Mom's lawyer, I said, anticipating his thoughts, along with copies of everything she documented about your financial abuse. If you want to challenge this, you're welcome to try. But I don't think you'll like what comes out during the legal proceedings. He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him finally understanding that he'd been outmaneuvered by the woman he'd spent 15 years underestimating. What am I supposed to do now? He asked. And for the first time since I'd known him, David sounded genuinely vulnerable. I suggest you figure out how to support yourself, I said. The way most people do, with a job. I turned to walk away, then paused and looked back at him. Oh, and David? You might want to start looking for somewhere else to live. Jake and I will be selling the house, and we'll need you to move out within 60 days. I left him standing there with Mom's will in his hands, finally understanding that his 15-year financial scam had not only failed, but had been completely exposed by the woman he thought he completely controlled. The reception continued around us, with people sharing stories about Mom's kindness, her dedication to her work, and her love for her family. No one seemed to notice that David had gone from grieving widower to devastated con man in the span of a 10-minute conversation. Later that evening, as Jake and I were cleaning up Mom's house and going through her belongings, we found more evidence of her careful planning. Hidden in her jewelry box was a safety deposit box key we didn't know existed. Inside the box, we found additional documentation of David's financial abuse, copies of all the legal documents she'd signed under pressure, and a letter addressed to both of us. My dear Rachel and Jake, the letter began. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone and David has probably discovered that his plans didn't work out the way he expected. Even from beyond the grave, Mom's sense of humor was intact. I want you to know that letting David manipulate me was not weakness. It was loneliness. I was so afraid of being alone that I convinced myself that being used was better than being isolated. I know you both tried to warn me about David, and I know my refusal to listen frustrated and hurt you. Please understand that I heard every word you said, but I wasn't ready to face the truth about my situation. It took my terminal diagnosis to give me the courage to act. Knowing that I was going to die anyway made it easier to risk the loneliness that would come with standing up to David. I may not have been brave enough to leave him while I was alive, but I was smart enough to make sure he wouldn't profit from my death. The letter went on to explain her legal strategy, her documentation process, and her hope that her experience would help other women recognize and escape financial abuse. Use my story to help others, she wrote. Make sure people understand that financial abuse is real, that it can happen to intelligent women, and that there are ways to fight back even when the situation seems hopeless. Most importantly, know that you were the lights of my life. Every sacrifice I made, every difficult decision I endured, was worth it because I got to be your mother. Love always, Mom. Reading that letter, Jake and I finally understood the full scope of what Mom had endured and the incredible strength it had taken for her to protect us even while she was dying. 3 months later, we learned the full extent of David's financial crimes when he was arrested for elder fraud in connection with a scheme involving several other widows he'd met through grief support groups. Apparently, his relationship with Mom wasn't an isolated incident. David had a pattern of targeting recently widowed women, gaining their trust through shared grief experiences, then systematically draining their financial resources through manipulation and emotional abuse. Mom's detailed documentation of his tactics became crucial evidence in the prosecution's case. Her affidavit helped establish the pattern of behavior that led to his conviction on multiple counts of elder fraud and financial abuse. David was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution to his victims. The house he thought he was going to inherit was sold to help cover his debts to the other women he defrauded. But the most important outcome of Mom's planning wasn't financial, it was personal. The scholarship fund Jake and I established in her memory has already helped 12 women escape financially abusive relationships. We use Mom's story to educate people about the warning signs of elder fraud and financial abuse, and we provide resources for victims who want to fight back. Your mother's courage in documenting her abuse probably saved other women from experiencing the same thing, the prosecutor told us after David's conviction. Her evidence was crucial in establishing the pattern that allowed us to build a strong case against him. Every time we help another woman recognize the signs of financial abuse, every time we provide resources that help someone escape a manipulative relationship, every time we share Mom's story with people who need to hear it, we honor the strength she showed in her final days. David thought he'd spent 15 years successfully conning a lonely widow out of her life savings. What he actually did was provide a strong, intelligent woman with a master class in financial fraud that she used to build an ironclad case against him. He thought Mom's death would set him free to enjoy the fruits of his manipulation. Instead, it set in motion a chain of events that led to his imprisonment and the protection of other potential victims. The will I handed him at Mom's funeral wasn't just a legal document, it was a declaration of war from a woman who'd been underestimated for the last time. 6 months after David's conviction, I received a letter from him in prison. He wanted to apologize, to explain his actions, to ask for forgiveness for the pain he caused our family. I threw the letter away without reading it completely. Some actions don't deserve forgiveness, and some people don't deserve second chances. But every day, I'm grateful for the lesson Mom taught me about the difference between weakness and strategy, between being a victim and being a survivor. She may have allowed David to take advantage of her loneliness, but she never let him steal her dignity or her intelligence. When she said, "Now I can be free" at her funeral, he thought he was talking about his freedom from the burden of caring for a sick wife. What he didn't realize was that he was actually describing Mom's freedom from having to pretend she didn't know what he was doing to her. Her real freedom came when she walked into that lawyer's office and took back control of her story. And our freedom came when we realized that being a victim of abuse doesn't make you weak. Fighting back makes you strong. The will Mom signed wasn't just about money, it was about justice. And sometimes, justice is as simple as making sure the right people end up with the right consequences for their choices. David thought he was playing a long game, spending 15 years setting up the perfect inheritance scam. But Mom was playing an even longer game, one that he never saw coming. The money she protected by changing her will has been life-changing for Jake and me, but not in the ways you might expect. We've used it responsibly, paying off student loans, buying modest homes, and investing in our futures. But more importantly, we've used it to continue Mom's fight against elder abuse. The Catherine Morrison Foundation for Elder Protection has become one of the leading resources in our state for helping victims of financial abuse. We provide legal assistance, counseling services, and educational programs that teach people how to recognize and combat manipulation tactics. Every year on Mom's birthday, we hold a conference where survivors of financial abuse share their stories and learn from experts about protecting themselves and their loved ones. David's conviction and Mom's documentation of his tactics have become a case study that's used to train law enforcement, social workers, and legal professionals. Your mother's bravery in fighting back has had ripple effects she never could have imagined, one of the conference speakers told me last year. Her story has probably prevented hundreds of other cases of elder fraud. That thought would have made Mom proud. She always believed that our struggles should be used to help others avoid similar pain. I think about her often, especially when I'm working with other families who are watching their loved ones being financially abused. The feelings of helplessness, frustration, and guilt that I experienced during Mom's ordeal are unfortunately common among family members who see the warning signs but don't know how to intervene. The hardest part is that they're making these decisions voluntarily, one daughter told me during a support group meeting. How do you protect someone from themselves? It's the same question Jake and I struggled with for years. The answer, we've learned, is that sometimes you can't. Sometimes all you can do is document everything, maintain relationships despite the manipulation tactics designed to isolate your loved one, and be ready to help when they're finally ready to accept it. Mom wasn't ready to accept our help until she was literally dying. But when she was ready, the foundation we tried to build over the years made it possible for her to fight back effectively. The key is never giving up, never accepting that abuse is inevitable, and never stopping the gentle pressure that reminds victims they have people who care about them and options for escape. 3 years later, I still get angry when I think about the 15 years David stole from Mom. Not just the money, though that was substantial, but the peace of mind she deserved in her golden years. The confidence she'd built over a lifetime that he systematically destroyed. The independence she'd valued that he convinced her to surrender. But I also feel proud when I think about how she fought back. How she recognized that her situation was hopeless, but her children's future didn't have to be. How she found the strength to document abuse, change her will, and create a legal foundation that would protect others even after she was gone. David may have taken 15 years of Mom's life, but Mom made sure those 15 years would ultimately serve a purpose beyond his personal enrichment. The woman who was too lonely to leave an abusive husband became the woman whose story helps other people recognize abuse before it's too late. The woman who felt helpless to protect her own financial security became the woman whose planning protected not just her children's inheritance, but the financial security of countless other potential victims. The woman who died believing she'd been weak became the woman whose strength inspired a movement. Last month, I received a call from a woman in California whose mother was being financially abused by her new husband. She'd read about Mom's case online and wanted advice about how to help. I feel so helpless, she said, crying over the phone. My mother won't listen to anything I say about this man. She keeps defending him even though it's obvious he's taking advantage of her. Keep loving her, I told her. Keep showing up. Keep documenting everything you can. And most importantly, keep reminding her that she has options and people who care about her. Did your mother ever thank you for not giving up on her? I thought about that question for a moment, remembering Mom's final weeks and the conversations we'd had about David, about money, about the choices she'd made. She didn't need to thank me, I said finally. She showed me her gratitude by finding the courage to fight back when it mattered most. That's the lesson I carry with me every day. Love isn't just about accepting people's choices, even when those choices are harmful. Sometimes love means applying gentle pressure, maintaining boundaries, and refusing to enable destructive behavior. Sometimes love means documenting abuse even when the victim isn't ready to acknowledge it. Sometimes love means being ready to help when someone finally asks for it. Sometimes love means making sure someone's story serves a purpose beyond their individual suffering. Mom taught me that even when you feel powerless, even when you're dying, even when you've spent years making choices you're ashamed of, you still have the power to choose how your story ends. She chose to end her story as a fighter rather than a victim. She chose to use her final days to protect her children and other potential victims rather than accepting defeat. She chose to transform 15 years of financial abuse into a blueprint for fighting back. David thought he was inheriting Mom's life savings when she died. Instead, he inherited the consequences of 15 years of documented financial crimes. Mom thought she was leaving behind the legacy of a woman who'd been too weak to protect herself. Instead, she left behind the legacy of a woman who'd been strong enough to protect everyone else. The will I handed David at Mom's funeral was more than a legal document. It was proof that victims of abuse can become advocates for justice, that women who feel powerless can find ways to fight back, that love and intelligence can triumph over manipulation and greed. Every time I tell Mom's story, every time I help another family recognize the signs of financial abuse, every time I see David's name in the news as a convicted felon, I remember the look on his face when he realized he'd been outmaneuvered by the woman he'd spent 15 years underestimating. He thought Mom's death would be his liberation. Instead, it was his downfall. He thought he was entitled to profit from her loneliness and desperation. Instead, he learned that even desperate people can be dangerous when they decide they have nothing left to lose. The phrase, "Now I can be free," that he whispered at Mom's funeral turned out to be prophetic. But the freedom he found wasn't the freedom he'd been expecting. His freedom was the freedom that comes with orange jumpsuits and prison cells, and the knowledge that everyone who'd ever respected him now knows exactly what kind of person he really is. Mom's freedom was the freedom that comes with knowing you've protected your children, exposed a predator, and turned your personal pain into a tool for helping others. I think about that difference every time someone asks me if I'm glad David went to prison, if I feel like justice was served, if Mom's plan worked the way she intended. The truth is, no amount of punishment can give Mom back the 15 years David stole from her. No prison sentence can undo the financial damage he caused or restore the confidence he destroyed. But her plan worked in ways that were more important than punishment or revenge. It worked because it protected other women from experiencing what she experienced. It worked because it showed that financial abuse can be documented and prosecuted. It worked because it proved that even when you feel powerless, you can still find ways to fight back. Most importantly, it worked because it transformed a story of victimization into a story of resistance, a story of shame into a story of courage, a story of defeat into a story of ultimate victory. When I handed David that will at Mom's funeral, I wasn't just delivering legal documents. I was delivering the news that his 15-year con game was over, that his victim had been smarter than he'd realized, and that his crimes had consequences he'd never anticipated. But more than that, I was delivering Mom's final message to the world. That women who are underestimated have a way of surprising people, that love and loneliness can make you vulnerable, but they don't have to make you stupid, and that sometimes the best revenge is making sure the truth comes out. The envelope I pulled from my purse that day contained more than a will. It contained 15 years of carefully documented evidence, a detailed confession of abuse, and a roadmap for other families facing similar situations. It contained Mom's refusal to let David's story be the final word on her life. It contained proof that even when you're dying, even when you feel defeated, even when you've made choices you regret, you still have the power to write your own ending. And sometimes, the ending you write becomes the beginning of someone else's fight for justice. That's the legacy Mom left behind, not just money for her children, but tools for fighting back against the kind of person who'd taken advantage of her grief and loneliness. Every time I help another family document financial abuse, every time I see a news story about elder fraud prosecution, every time I meet someone who's found the courage to leave an abusive relationship, I think about the woman who was too afraid to leave her abuser, but brave enough to make sure he couldn't hurt anyone else. David said he could finally be free when Mom died. What he didn't understand was that Mom's death was the beginning of the most important work of her life, protecting other women from people exactly like him. The will she signed wasn't an ending. It was a declaration of war against everyone who thinks loneliness makes people easy targets, that grief makes people stupid, that desperation makes people deserving of abuse. It was Mom's way of saying that even women who make bad choices out of loneliness deserve justice, that even victims who seem complicit in their own abuse deserve protection, that even people who can't save themselves can still save others. 3 years later, as I continue the work Mom started with her final act of courage, I understand that the true inheritance she left us wasn't money. It was the knowledge that love means fighting for people even when they can't fight for themselves, that justice sometimes comes from unexpected places, and that the strongest women are often the ones who've learned their strength through surviving people who tried to destroy them. David thought he'd spent 15 years breaking down a lonely widow. What he actually did was provide a strong woman with the motivation she needed to become a warrior. And warriors, as he learned too late, don't go down without a fight.